Thank you, everybody who is here this morning for, we're calling it halftime for Esser. In the context, in terms of sports analogies, we could say halftime, the fourth quarter, overtime. We'll go through all of those as we're talking for today, but just as we're thinking about things, Esser may be the single largest one-off federal investment in support for K-12 districts. We've got a looming deadline and a looming cliff for the obligation and spending of the sort of resources. And so we wanted to have a conversation today about what is actually happening on the ground with that spending. What are the challenges that districts are facing and that they're reaching and like sort of trying to address with that spending? And how will we know that it's an opportunity for actual impact and deal with the other side of what comes after Esser? So we've got a great panel of folks with us here, and maybe out of all of us, I might start with that first question to Dr. Enfield, who is on the ground in a district. Between your experience and the experience of your peers, what are you seeing at this moment in time for the obligation and spending of Esser? How are you thinking about it?
Great. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. So I am about 9.5 months into the superintendency in the Washoe County School District, which is Reno, Nevada, 61,000 students. And so I am coming into the district sort of, when Esser plans have largely really been laid out. But one of the first things I did was look specifically at what the areas were that the team had identified for Esser spending, and were we on track to spend it down? And in doing that review, it turns out we were not in some cases. And so I did a pretty quick pivot and said, okay, let's identify some real strategic priorities that we can get some multi-year contracts in place. So things like our growth system, things, big ticket items. So trying to get people to think strategically, think long-term, and I will say that, the challenge now, I know there's a perception that we're gonna leave all this money on the table. I can guarantee you I'm not leaving a penny on the table, okay? However, I also want to be clear with this. I also won't spend to spend. And this is unfortunately something that we see in districts too much at the end of the year. Your Title I budget, use it or lose it, and so you buy like 8,000 colored pencils, right? Which is not really going to impact the lives of children in a meaningful way. So I've really been pushing our team to be thinking strategic, long-term, maximum impact on kids. And I think that we're doing an okay job, but I think the biggest problem is the public perception that we're just swimming in cash with no sense of direction, and that's not the case.
I love that visual, swimming in cash. Yeah, Scrooge McDuck. As we think about that and think about the public perception, I think it's very interesting. You talked about two pieces of public perception there. One was the notion of swimming in cash, and the other was the notion of doing anything, almost lighting money on fire to get it out the door. I guess a question for all of our panelists: how do you see people using tools to strike that balance between making sure they get resources out the door and at the same time understanding ways of knowing it's going to be impactful and tracking and understanding what that impact is?
You're giving me a piercing gaze, so I guess I'll take that one. I'm Jess Gartner. I'm the CEO and founder of Allovue, and we work with school districts on strategic budgeting and financial management tools. And I've been really upset about some of these perception gaps for a long time because we see these big numbers, right? 190 billion, that's a number that is so large that nobody can wrap their head around it in terms of that purchasing power and what that really means, right? It just seems like an astronomical sum. And one of my favorite things to say, I think I'm gonna start printing it on t-shirts and hats, is denominators matter. I was a huge nerd in school, as you can probably guess, and denominators matter. And by that I mean, $190 billion did not go to Susan Enfield's personal checking account, much to her chagrin and dismay. We have to divide that $190 billion by the 50 million students that it needs to benefit, which is how many students we have in K-12. When you divide anything by 50 million, it gets much, much smaller. And then we need to divide that number again by the 6 fiscal years that those funds were eligible for. We never, ever communicate money in terms of multiple years. And the joke I was saying to people is like, if I went on a date and someone said, I make $1 million, and they meant over 10 years, I think we would all feel a little bit misled. So why are we talking about school budgets that way? Nobody thinks about money that way. And, I think Susan I had talked to really early on about this, and she quickly did the math in her head on the district and said, oh, yeah, that number is much smaller. And really, we're talking about $600 per kid per year on average. That's really what we're talking about. That's not a transformative sum, right? And so we really do have to be careful about how we are thinking about the ramp up and denouement of these dollars. But the other thing that I think is so important to keep in mind here is we're really talking about like a 5% bump. That's what it amounts to, is on average, it's a 5% bump, right? For most people, you maybe see that in a mid-year bonus. Now, if you get a 5% bump as a surprise, you're probably not going out and buying a new house. You're probably not changing your lifestyle in any meaningful way. You're not quitting your job. You might go on a nice vacation. Now imagine if somebody came and looked at your finances and said, no groceries, no rent, tickets to Cabo. How irresponsible. Well, no, the irresponsible thing would be putting your rent on the one-time money. So we have this weird dynamic where we have folks that are looking at these expenditures in isolation of the other 95% of spending that is recurring and saying, why aren't they doing these critical initiatives with it? It's like, well, because they want the critical initiatives to stay around and survive the grant. So, I say, really, the districts who are spending this money the smartest are not putting their highest priority spending on Esser. They're putting the expenditures that make the most sense for one-time funding.
And thank you for coming to Jess's TED Talk.
I was just going to say we're 8 minutes in and we haven't brought up AI, which I think we've violated the 2023 Code of Conduct here at ASU+GSV. I did, however, put into ChatGPT before the panel, because I thought we could save us a bunch of time, how should the remaining Esser funding be spent? It crashed my browser every single time. So no solution yet there. I think from our perspective, we try and put ourselves in the shoes of folks like Dr. Enfield, educators, teachers, students, parents at Remind, and think about 3 numbers that really kind of step out. 50% of students came into this school year below grade level in one or more subjects. 90% of parents think their student is at grade level or above. And only 10% of students have been able to get access to high-dosage tutoring, the one research-backed solution that really does help kids close that learning gap. So we try and frame it that way and then think about what can we do, again, in concert with communities like Dr. Enfield's to do a couple things. One, help them foster relationships. I think Dr. Enfield talked about on our pre-call really eloquently the notion of culture and building those relationships and doing things that foster that relationship building because it's so connected to learning. And that's a core part of what Remind's about. And then also being able to bring that high dosage tutoring in. And I think one of the challenges that we work with a lot now with the districts and schools on is how can they operationalize that? How can they make that part of how they do everything every day? Because that number of kids that were below grade level before the pandemic was still more than a third. So helping them get there through high dosage tutoring is also something that we're very centered around. And then not the least of which is making sure that they can spend the money on staff and that there's educators. I keep reading stories. There's an article in the Washington Post this morning about this topic. If you haven't seen it, grab it and read it. And it does point out, hard decisions that have to be made, unfortunately, around staffing and not being able to put people in the buildings or even finish some of the facility work that needs to be done so that we can always keep kids in the building with the educator. So those are the really three things that we think about, two of which we can be pretty hands-on with, one of which is less in our control, but once those people are together, then our two components can really help, I think, move towards that, bringing every child to grade level.
Yeah, so I'm new at the Gates Foundation, and prior to this, I was working in the administration. I served as director of ed tech during part of the pandemic. So I got to see the other side of trying to put out this money. And look, it's I don't want to call it like when you're on an online dating app and you want to be the person that's seen as making $1 million a year in your analogy, and therefore looking like you're super helpful to the public. Like there is some of that going on out there. But I do also think, to your denominator conversation or point, that how these dollars are being distributed is very different to different schools and different districts and different states. So there are some people who do have more of an excess of money. And while it might average out to 5%, there are some places where it's a 300% in the discretionary spending that might be happening. So it does vary. And I think some people are using it well, and some people are using it less well, and some people are in different circumstances and situations. And some people just don't always know the best ways to use it in the first place. And the reality is money doesn't buy everything. It doesn't buy happiness, and apparently it doesn't buy full success in education either, right? But at least we've removed this excuse. So I think of it this way. It's like, you're on the highway and you're in a traffic jam, right? We're locked up. We're trying to get kids to go further, and someone just gave us a Ferrari. But that didn't mean we actually go any faster, right? We actually have to clear up a number of things. And I think different districts and different places are getting better and better at that. I think it is seen as this one-time money. So there are some one-time expenditures, like upgrading your HVAC system, which is not the most innovative thing on the planet, but really something that's necessary. But there's other things that you can do which are costs that you could replace something else if successful. So you could try innovative curriculum or innovative assessments or new professional development models where if it works, there is something that it can take over or replace in your current budget. And I think the places that I've seen be the most innovative are the ones that try to not just add some fundamentally new expense, but they try to innovate within existing line items so that there is a place to pick up that money and go. And I think that is a real opportunity, not just to date, but I think it is a way that we can go forward in the second half.
Well, I'm Hardeep Gulati. I'm the CEO of Powerschool. A lot of great analogies. I don't think I can beat any of that. So Ferraris and dating and all. So I'll try to, I think hopefully you got the point that this is not a whole lot of money. We all need the money. We can probably use some more. There's tons of great use of it. And I think we saw that pretty much districts needed whatever critical systems they try to go in this first half, they try to go spend that, which is the right use of cash. So it's perfect that we are able to have. Some of the stats, like the fact that now the devices, what used to be 60% in US access to the kids, now it's almost 80%. Well, that's game changing. I think we've had a pivotal moment with this funding, so people are putting really good use of the money, so we should definitely encourage and celebrate that. I think we get an advantage that we serve almost 80% of the North American school districts on technology. We are seeing that lens from a technology, how districts are actually leveraging, which is very encouraging. A lot of districts have went through the COVID where they realized that their systems were were very antiquated. They didn't have online enrollments. You could not have people standing in the line anymore to take that. You couldn't do classrooms without proper learning management systems. You could not do even payrolls or even hiring teachers remotely. All that system was lacking in these districts. So we have seen tons of districts who are taking advantage of that. We just last quarter signed up Puerto Rico. Amount of hurricanes that hit Puerto Rico, you can imagine how much they needed a new modern SIS. Well, they're using the Esser money to help get them modernize the SIS. That's a great use of stuff. We have used Miami-Dade buying learning management system to help with that district. South Carolina buying our professional learning to help make sure that professional learning to all the new teachers and all stuff is happening. So it's a phenomenal to see the amount of digital transformation. We are seeing districts actually taking advantage of this money to help them drive that. But I think, Dominic, you also touched upon one of the biggest thing what we see is there's still a lot of spray and pray around the learning loss and recovery and how really some of this cash is spent. What's exciting to me is the phase we are seeing now in the second half, where now districts are saying, great, I spend, but what's my ROI? How do I make sure this was the best use of the cash? How much I make sure that every dollar I'm spending is actually giving me the best return on that investment? Typically, technology has the highest ROI in a lot of things because we can't throw bodies at this problem, right? We can't even hire as many teachers as we want. So we already have open seats. So we know the bodies are not going to help alone. We need technology to help create that additional. And we are seeing now actually a lot of renewed interest in analytics, which used to be a thought, but now actually people want to put it in implementation. So, I think, again, the district leaders like Dr. Enfield are doing a phenomenal job, and we should celebrate that, not jeopardize it.
So I think one point that I really want to emphasize as well is the reason why this conversation is so important is A, facts matter. And I think it's really important that we're talking about this factually and not letting sort of this narrative of clueless district leaders just lighting money on fire prevail. And here's why. Public education is under intense scrutiny and criticism right now in many parts of this country. What will happen when these dollars are gone and people don't see a miraculously transformed public education system? It's going to get ugly fast. And so we've really got to, I think these conversations are important because we've got to wrap our arms around this narrative and make sure that we're telling it accurately, or else there's going to, I think, be potential tremendous blowback on schools for not having used the dollars smarter.
I actually want to respond to something Chris said about using some of these dollars to try some new things and to innovate. At this conference in particular, you hear a lot of criticism about how districts are slow to innovate, they're slow to adopt new things, they are not very, they're risk averse. A big reason for that is a resource-strained entity is disincentivized to experiment because the incentives for success are very minimal. The disincentives for failure are catastrophic. So if everything is either or and never both and, the rational person does the thing that is fine. One-time money like this is a gift in the sense that you can have a little room to experiment. You have a little bit of room to do both and. You can try high dosage tutoring and after school. It's not either or. And then you can evaluate and have some data and say, hey, this is the thing we really saw work well here. This is the thing we saw work really well here. And the other thing that's extra tricky about this is that kids and schools are not coin operated, right? They're just not, it's not like buying a Facebook ad and seeing how many clicks we get. You might have something that is extraordinarily effective in one school or even one district, and the school down the street, it doesn't work. Why? Well, because the principal at that school forgot to tell the teachers that we had it, or we didn't do, right? I mean, you're all laughing because this is just a very real example. And those variables and those human components are very real, and in a perfect world, giving schools enough supplemental resources to take some risks, to run some experiments, would be wildly beneficial to everyone. But with current resource constraints, at best, in many cases, we're backfilling, right? Why are we using this money for HVAC? Because we needed to do that HVAC upgrade 10 years ago, and we're $180 billion in the hole on capital funding.
I'd actually say that in many ways, schools and districts moved very quickly, particularly around tutoring, and moved fast and got tutoring out, albeit in a way that maybe long-term doesn't have the highest efficacy. So homework help solutions, which were easy, able to be deployed pretty quickly, I think we're finding get very low utilization and have very low efficacy. And the hard challenge of getting high dosage tutoring out is now what's kind of right in view, and whether that's done on premise or online or both is really what we want to continue to help the districts and schools be able to deliver, because that's how we will help them close the learning gaps. But I think everything Jess said is dead on. And yet at the same time, it was really empowering to see how fast they went out and said, hey, learning loss, learning recovery is something that's called out with these dollars. Let's try and get solutions in place. Unfortunately, the other challenge with tutoring is the kids that need it the most are the less engaged, and their parents are sometimes the hardest to reach. And so really the key KPI becomes, how do you get those sessions to the kids that need it the most, those 15, 20, 30% of kids that aren't showing up to class, whose parents don't come to back to school night, and how does, in our case, two-way communication help this scenario where, hey, you missed your tutoring session yesterday, we've rescheduled it already for you, and by the way, we sent this message to your parent, right? So that when you do come home at night, you guys can talk about making sure you get those sessions. Because when the sessions happen, again, Susanna Loeb's here, and the work she's done with NSAA is so powerful about the impact that high-dosage tutoring actually has if the sessions can get delivered. And so that's a non-trivial amount of work, because that's not something that's been part of Dr. Enfield's or any of these communities' kind of day-to-day operation. But what COVID, I guess, is a silver lining, helps shine a light on is, like, how can we help bring that into part of how the schools operate and do it in a way that scales and leverages technology, as Hardeep said, and data and analytics to be able to identify, hey, these are the kids that need it, and they need it in these subjects, and it needs to be persistent and with a tutor that they can build a relationship with.
Yeah. It's, let's just take a step back for a second, because it's sort of incredible that we're having this conversation, because facts matter here. The Esser dollars were a set of emergency funds to try to sustain a school system that was existing because we were in crisis. It wasn't actually a transformative innovation fund to try to shift everything. Right? So now we have a school system that largely has remained standing, that schools are back open, we're in place, and the expectation is now to do something more with it. And it's interesting why that's even the case. And that's the case because parents got an insight into what was happening in school for the first time. We're like, this ain't good enough. So now I not only want you to maintain the system under more constraining situations and circumstances, the kids who are further behind, fewer staff availability, and a bunch of new technologies that no one's been trained on. I would also like you to transform it, please. And by the way, why aren't you doing that fast enough? And if you don't do it fast enough, I'm going to yank away the dollars. Like, this is sort of an insane conversation that we're having in the first place. And then let's put the facts that it's only 5%. And we have school boards who won't agree to do anything because they're all scared for rational reasons, mostly. I just want to, like, put this conversation.
I think I'm looking at a career change after listening to this, Chris.
No, but here's the hopeful part of all that, which is we've come all the way from emergency funds to keep a school system alive to a public recognition of a need to transform it with really high expectations from the public, right? And we need to actually recognize that and take hold of that and not just push back and say, well, we shouldn't have used it this way, that way, but maybe we need to grab this expectation and say, if this is what you want from the school system, look, we survived here, but it's going to take a bit more, right, if we're really going to drive this. And we're starting to see that conversation evolve. So I'm seeing that glimmer of hope out there, right? The conversation, the Senate announced just recently that they're reopening the conversation about Ezra and what should change, and I believe public comments on the first round are due today or something like that, right? Like, there is real interest in a rather, Congress isn't the most functional being in general. It's not the most functional being right now, and they're even engaging in this. So I just want us to take the moment back and say, as frustrating and as crazy as it is, this is actually raising the bar so that maybe we can actually change things in education, and I think that's hopeful and exciting and wildly frustrating at the same time.
I fully concur that, because I think it's become our really a national pastime now to point out all the problems with K-12. It's almost like every day you open an article, there'll be something about K-12, right? Which is good that we're getting all the attention, but unfortunately, we're getting the wrong attention. We're kind of pointing out the problems, not celebrating all the successes. And like the digital readiness in the classroom, that's a big success. We should be celebrating that. There's no other country which has that kind of a numbers, and all the Esser money did help a lot of that. We were able to have continuum of learning. Some of, McKinsey have talked about some of the Middle Eastern countries, how much almost the learning loss was years. When you look at international, a lot of the countries struggled. We actually had much less compared to anywhere else in the globe. We haven't celebrated that either. So I think there's so much to be celebrated about how districts have been able to keep the learning going, keep the education going. And now, while they're, the funds were meant to put the house on, not on fire, right, to address the fire, but also use that while you're doing it, can you do it in a way that it actually sets you up that in the future, any kind of disruptions can be managed as well. And now if you can take that one step further, to the point Brian was making, is like, great, we wanted to put tutors because, again, we're trying to provide support to all the kids who need, but multiple superintendents have pointed out that, hey, the usage is only less than 20-30%, which is also the same thing with some of the content. And it's sometimes the 20-30% of the kids who really need it, they're not. So can we move now to the next phase, which is more surgical? And this is where the data and analytics really helps to understand, and let's start pointing out the surgical nature of the rest of the money to really address some of the things, and that will help us address the future as well. So it's a perfect opportunity for us.
Yeah, I'm glad Chris brought up parents, because for Remind, we have over 11 million parents that use Remind every month. So we've seen parents engaged and active in communicating with their teachers or their counselors or their coaches or the other educators in the system. And so being able to take data, be able to take information, be able to take an MTSS program and make that available to that really tight-knit group of educator, teacher, student, parent, coach, counselor is really powerful, and it's right in front of us. And the reality is it happens all the time. It's happening thousands of times, even in the last week probably in Dr. Enfield's community. And it doesn't get as much attention as the challenges. And so that's something that I'm glad you brought up parents, because parents, yeah, they got a front row seat, but they've always been pretty actively involved. But now through technology, we have the ability to let them get more involved and know that, that 90% of parents who think their kids at grade level, that's not accurate. How do we help them understand where their child is and that they need to support them, whether it's tutoring, whether it's being more engaged with their teacher in math or English language learning or whatever the case may be.
I also want to put a finer point on the piece about the expectations relative to funding. The public conversation jumped so quickly to reading proficiency, right? Where do we lose on reading, math? But the superintendents that I know were trying to figure out, how do we make sure kids are fed? What do we do about the kids whose parents are frontline workers and they don't have school to go to? Are they sitting home alone? How do we keep kids alive? How do we keep kids safe? I think Sonia Santelices in Baltimore was like personally negotiating with Comcast executives for community internet. So one of the most common questions I get all the time is, well, Jess, when will it be enough, right? The spending goes up every year. I imagine you're not still getting paid what you were in 1993 either, right? Enough for what? Because at some point, we insidiously made the societal decision that superintendents were going to be responsible for everything. Mental health, safety, infrastructure, water, health, winter coats. What the list does not end. And feed them 3 times a day. And let's make sure that we have modern facilities. Is any other public agency going to step in and do their part here? Or they just all get a pass and Dr. Enfield's in the headlines about it?
I think it's going to be the latter, but unfortunately, but I do want to double down on what Jess has said and what Chris has said, because she is absolutely right. The first, because we've gotten this money in like 3 phases, right? The first phase was survival. There was nothing strategic or innovative about it, right? I was literally just figuring out how I was going to feed kids, keep them connected via internet, because in my part of the world in Seattle, I had over 10,000 kids that didn't set foot in a school from March of 2020 until August or September of 21. So how was I also going to keep them connected to a sense of community? in a really, really scary moment in history. So there was a lot. Now, to Chris's point, though, now we're out of that initial crisis. I have to make sure people are fed and connected and well. And now we can actually be using the money strategically. And here's the other thing, though. Every district's local context is different. Every district has different needs. Every state has different ways of funding. In Nevada, they just choose not to fund public education at all. So, we all are going to have to use these dollars very, very strategically. And so, for example, I'm making some big bets right now because I'm in Nevada, so why not? Our legislature meets in a biennium, so it's the legislative session right now, and they are poised to make a significant and long overdue investment in public education in the state of Nevada. We're likely going to get some significant funding. So what I'm doing is I've used a lot of my Esser dollars to put some very needed foundational pieces in place for my district, knowing that I'll likely have the money to keep it going in 3 years because the state's coming through. But I'm front loading it now with Esser dollars because I can, right? That's just the smart way to do it. So I do think that you're seeing districts now be more strategic and to some degree innovative because we're out of the initial crisis and taking care of people that we were in the beginning.
I just want to echo, because I'm afraid that 2 years from now, Susan, you're going to tell me that you're no longer a superintendent in reference back to this conversation.
This was the moment.
This was the tipping point. But I do think we need to do a better job as a society to celebrate the people who are on the front line and for all their successes that they've had instead of continuing to attack them. And I think we need to figure out collectively how to do that. I also want to highlight that, before the pandemic, there were still plenty of students who weren't eating when they came to school. Like the crisis is just less acute, but it doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of communities that are still in that crisis or just a new form of crisis, whether or not that's mental health or not. And therefore, plenty of these resources need to continue to go to a number of those services, and we need to not forget that there are still many students in crisis, even though it's just not the national headline the same way anymore.
Well said. And the other thing, too, that I will say is, and I think Chris and I may have been on a webinar together during the pandemic, talking about how we were, no one was going to go back to normal. We were going to come out all transformed in public education from the pandemic. And, while I wanted to believe that pretty story, I said early on, the muscle memory of a bureaucracy like public education is strong. And I have yet to see a school system in this country that is radically transformed from what it was doing pre-pandemic. But I think we still have a moment with these dollars to do some transformational things if we can create some public will, I think, to do it and some support.
So on that point, I would just love for everybody to picking up on it. What is one of the changes or transformations or investments that we've seen through Esser that maybe is not going to survive the snapback of the other side of the cliff that we're worried about?
A message of optimism there. No, I won't go first, but yeah.
Not going to survive.
I mean, to Susan's point, what's so hard about so many of these conversations is we have over 15,000 LEAs in this country. They all look very different. We have 500 student LEAs. We have million student LEAs, different urbanicities, geographies, state legislatures, local politics, and different Esser amounts, right? And so I see some superintendents reading these headlines just completely like, this is not for me. We got $5 in Esser funding, right? It was nothing. And then there are other districts, few and far between, who got very sizable sums. But because it went proportional to the title formula, those are also the districts who had the steepest hill to climb in terms of getting kids fed and keeping kids safe and most vulnerable to all of the other impacts of the pandemic. And so I think it really is just going to be very localized in terms of what did work, what can we reassess, where did we see some glimmers that we want to double down on. And I also think that the response of state legislatures to this will be the biggest determinant of what we can do going forward, right? If there are state legislatures that said, weird, our conversation about education changed a lot when we had these different funding opportunities, let's keep that going, that's very different than, well, you had $190 billion and not every kid is advanced reading yet, so maybe we're going to cut funding now because you clearly don't know how to manage it.
Well, can I just say, I think one of the greatest risks right now is that we are going to regress. And what I mean by that is the conversations I'm hearing in my state are getting back to reading and math scores, reading and math scores. Reading and math is super important. I'm not saying that that's not our job, but I think it's sort of they're going back to sort of a minimalist approach, and that's all we're going to focus on. And so I worry that some of the more innovative things that we're doing are going to go by the wayside because we're going to get so much pressure to just focus on, because of the fear of the reality of learning loss, focusing on that very, very narrow definition of student success.
Yeah, I agree. And to your question, I think what won't snap back and frankly shouldn't snap back is homework help. And that solution, which has proven to get very low single-digit utilization and adoption rates, and largely by the kids that, good on them, seek it out, who want to go from a B to an A, which is laudable and great, but not the intent of tutoring. And the optimistic part is the need is there. How do we continue to help learning communities like Dr. Enfield's operationalize high-dosage tutoring to the percentage of kids that are the furthest below grade level, however that's measured, and help them get to grade level. And I think that's something that I know will persist because the need is there and the efficacy behind high-dosage tutoring. But to the points about definitions and metrics matter, being really crisp about what we say and what we mean when we talk about high-dosage tutoring versus other definitions of tutoring that are not that.
I think the thing that really existed when the pandemic was first in full swing, the more I was talking to teachers and students, the thing I heard overwhelmingly time and time again was compassion. That my teachers understand and they're talking to me and they are treating me like I matter. My administration is treating me like I matter. It feels like there was compassion, the communities were coming together. I think that's the thing that already snapped back, and I think it snapped back hard. And we've lost some things in that. And I'm hoping that corrects itself again at some point. I think on the flip side, from the optimistic part of this, I think there's a lot of good infrastructure in place to take advantage of not only things like AI, because we need to get it in here one more time.
Good job. Checks in the mail.
The checks in the mail. But I think getting that infrastructure in place so that some of this change can happen later, I think there is real demand that exists, and to me, I'm hopeful that this is sort of like the dot-com bubble moment bursting, where everyone's like, the internet, I think it's going to change everything in all these radical ways, and in like 99, 2000, people were like, it didn't do it. And then it turns out, as it played out into 2008 and 2010 and 2020, it did actually change things. And my hope is that we will look back at so many things that got put in place, bringing parents in, certain technologies in place, laid the groundwork for that change that we'll see. It's just going to be a bit longer than everybody's thinking and hoping.
So I don't want to give another negative headline to, why it's something not working. Again, I'm the believer, as Jess was saying, every bit of the dollars being spent has a value to some child, right? So we got to not, again, point out, hey, this doesn't have enough ROI. That's not the intent. I think the intent needs to be is about, okay, what's working and where can we talk about. One area which I think maybe we didn't touch enough about is the multi-tier system of support. I think everybody's kind of alluding to there's multiple things, more than reading and efficiency, proficiencies and all. It's attendance, it's behavior, it's special needs kids, it's somebody has other aspects of whether they're taken care of for their career pathways and they're struggling on figuring out what do they want to do next. How do we really track that as a framework? And what we have seen is, like, take example, state of Alabama, they actually, the legislative, approved the whole MTSS project outside the Esser money. So we are having states who are actually taking, not just looking at Esser, they know that they need to go over and beyond. Maryland used Esser money to implement MTSS. So we're seeing that to be one of the big trends, and it's welcoming because it's a holistic approach.
Yeah.
I feel like it's a good sign for a conversation where it feels like it's halftime for this conversation. There's more to be said, but we're towards the end of our time. I just want to thank everybody for participating and being deeply engaged throughout, and hopefully continue the conversation as we all leave the stage.
Thanks.